If you got a Bible, go to 2 Samuel chapter 9. We're going to be there in just a second as we enter in this morning. One of the things that you may have noticed is that our student section feels like it's a little light this morning, and that's because a group of our students drove up to Alpine this Friday to be part of a retreat for the next, today is the last day, but just experiencing the goodness of the Lord. And so continue to pray for them. They're finishing up this morning, and then they'll be headed back. But as much as it's important that they receive something from the Lord there, the ultimate hope, anytime somebody goes away for something, is that what they received up there, they come back and it shapes the trajectory of their life going forward. So be praying for our juniors and seniors as they are returning from, or I think sophomores as well, returning from that retreat. Last week, we started a new series called Gospel Fluency, and I tried to begin to build this idea that the hope for us as a gospel people is to be fluent in a gospel language, that it's so natural to us that when life squeezes, it's what comes out of us. And as we think about that more, even thinking about the nature of how language works, language isn't just you have words, and if you think about the words hard enough, that eventually they mean something. In fact, you're not really fluent in a language until you can tell story in that language. And so when I was in high school, I took 3 years of Latin. Think whatever you want to think about how nerdy it is, it was more nerdy than that. And so Latin 1, we're learning the basics of the language. Latin 2, we're learning more. Latin 3, there was only 8 of us that survived that far. And so we watched lots of movies, but one of our final projects was that we had to throw a play in Latin. And so doing this play in Latin, we decided that we were going to do a Scooby-Doo style murder mystery. And so I became the sheriff in my bright red hat, and I didn't even have a speaking part. I just had a dancing part in this. And so if you want to see what that looked like, if you turn your eyes, no, just kidding. There is no video footage of that. And if there were, I would have bought it off the dark web by now, right? Like that just doesn't need to exist. But the whole point that she was testing us in is your mastery of this language actually depends on the story that you're able to tell in it. And so even thinking about what we're doing, like the gospel is not just meant to be this language that we know. It's actually meant to be this story that we live. And so maybe smarter than I can say it, there's a man named Jeff Vanderstelt who wrote a book by the title of Gospel Fluency. We quoted from the intro. Now we're going to quote a little bit further into the book. And here's what he says. Culture shapes language. And you get that. That's why when your kid comes home and they say 6, 7, and you have no idea what they're talking about, it's because you're not part of that culture. Right? Like you just have no idea. I don't have any idea either. So culture shapes language, but language shapes culture. And so the reality is that we have developed better words to talk about mental illness and things that people go through, and we are actually a better culture for it because not only does culture shape language, but language shapes culture. And stories have the power to redefine or create new language. Our words have meaning because of the stories in which they are used, and we understand our words from the story we find ourselves in. Now, the reason why I think that's important is because when you think about culture, the reality is that the best story wins. So when you're watching the Super Bowl and all of these commercials are happening, the best commercial isn't the thing that explains to you how to use this product. It's the Doritos commercial that makes you think that your cardboard box is going to take you to space and give you chips because the best story wins. It's when you're watching sports. And so, for instance, last year during the World Series, maybe you don't care that much about baseball, but they start telling the story of Freddie Freeman and his dad and his kids. And all of a sudden, you're crying like, you're the real MVP, Freddie. You should win it all. Because the best story wins. And the reality is that even in stories, like stories are really not all that different. They actually all kind of have the same pattern, at least good stories. And so you can think of a movie like Rocky. And so here's the story. Rocky is the hero, and Rocky can't get out of his own way. And so he needs somebody to help him. And that person that helps him is Mick. And Mick teaches him how to train. And all of a sudden, he can get past the thing that he was stuck in, tripping over his own feet, not being accomplished. And all of a sudden, he's able to stand toe-to-toe with the champion of the world in a way that nobody thought he was going to be able to. That's also the story of the Lion King. Simba can't get out of his own way. Ends up having to run away from his home because of the death of his father, ends up running into a warthog and a meerkat and tries to figure out how to do for life. They give him some guidance, not really great guidance, but some guidance. And then he meets Rafiki. Rafiki reminds him of who he is. He goes back and he's able to overcome, not be able to get out of his own way, and he becomes king. This is the story of Star Wars. Luke Skywalker has a high midichlorian count, but doesn't know how to tap into his skills. And so he needs Obi-Wan and he needs Yoda to teach him how to be who he's supposed to be. And all of a sudden he's able to overcome. Like, this is the story over and over again. Every story has a pattern and the best story wins. And my hope this morning with you is, as we talk through the gospel, to just let you see that the gospel is a better story than any of those stories. And so here's our main idea. The gospel is not just a theological term. It's a better story that we are invited to live. And so what we're going to do is we're going to just walk through 2 Samuel chapter 9. And I don't even think I'm going to preach this morning. If you'd give me the liberty, I just want to tell you a story for the next several minutes. Let me pray, and then we'll enter in. And so Jesus, thank you. Thank you for your word. Thank you for your people. Thank you that you are shaping us by giving us meaning through the faithful story of you entering into our world and redeeming us. Would you help us to see that even more clearly today? It's in your matchless name I pray. Amen. 2 Samuel chapter 9, starting in verse 1, we simply say this. David asked, "Is there anyone remaining from the family of Saul I can show kindness to for Jonathan's sake?" There was a servant of Saul's family named Ziba. They summoned him to David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" "I am your servant," he replied. And so the king asked, "Is there anyone left of Saul's family that I can show the kindness of God to?" Now, you need some context here, because without that, some of these names mean very little. And so David is obviously famous of David and Goliath fame, and this is actually pretty early in his reign, or at least in the chronicling of his reign as king over all of united Israel. But before that, he wasn't the first king. The king before him was a man named Saul. And Saul, because of David's exploits of killing Goliath, actually began to feel some insecurity and decided that he was going to try and get rid of David. And so David actually spent a lot of years in exile running from Saul. And during that period of exile, Saul was fighting against an enemy army, the Philistines, gets wounded in battle, and in not wanting the Philistines to kill him, he says to his armor bearer, the guy that's carrying him stuff, "Hey, will you kill me, because I don't want them to have the pleasure of killing me?" And the guy's like, "Man, you're the king that God anointed. I can't kill you. I'm not doing that." So Saul falls on his own sword. That's actually where that term falling on your sword comes from. His armor bearer sees it and is like, "Well, if you gone, I'm gone," falls on his sword, and they're both dead. The Philistines show up and they're like, "Oh, great." Take his crown, cut off his head, take his body, hang it outside one of their cities. It's this horrific moment in the history of Israel. And so David finds out what happens because somebody comes running to tell him, "Hey, this is what happened to Saul." And the guy actually tries to take credit for it when he had nothing to do with it. And David looks him in the face and says, "You would dare put your hand on God's anointed," and kills him right there on the spot. And what sets off afterwards is this kind of burgeoning civil war between all of Israel, who is still kind of thinking somebody from Saul's family should still be king. And then David, who in Judah, they're saying, no, David should be king because he was anointed to be king a long time ago. And what starts building up is particularly this man named Ishbosheth, who is the son of Saul, and then a man named Abner, who's the commander of the Israelite army. They're doing their thing, and then David at the same time is building up his forces with the sons of Zeruiah, particularly a guy named Joab, and they're trying to figure out what's going on, and Abner ends up killing Joab's brother, Asher, and so now Joab's like, now we got a problem. So this is the story of The Godfather 3, right? Like this is what seems to be happening right now. And so this civil war begins to build, and David is actually trying to make things better. And so he invites Abner over and says, "Hey, Abner, if you could bring me the wife that I have that's one of Saul's daughters, I'll call everything good." And so Abner shows up to try and make a deal, and as he's leaving, Joab catches him in the back and is like, cha, 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 and takes him out, right? Like now it's a prison story. And so I don't know how you translate cha, 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 cha. I don't know. Somebody's going to transcribe this and be like, what just happened? I don't know. And so Abner gets killed. And then Ishbosheth finds out that Abner's dead, and some guys come to him in the middle of the night while he's sleeping, and they shank him in his sleep. And so David is heartbroken because of how this is going down, but now he's got no contenders, and so he is the king. And then what we begin to see roll out is chapter 5, he ends up being in Jerusalem and he unites the kingdom. Chapter 6, the Ark of the Covenant comes back home. Chapter 7, he's sitting there saying, I need to build something from the Lord. And the Lord's like, no. I'm going to build something for you, and forever you're going to have somebody from your family on the throne. Chapter 8 begins to record all of the victories that David's winning. And so when you get to chapter 9, it feels like all the momentum has been around this kingdom that is being established, that's not going to be overturned by enemies and has been given forever to God. And then we enter into this story that David's sitting on his throne in his kindness, looking for people to be nice to. In fact, it's really important because this term kindness will show up multiple times. Already twice in the text that we've read, but it's going to begin to show up. It's going to show up again a little bit later. But this idea of kindness is really important. It's actually a word, hesed, and that word actually shows up 245 times in the Old Testament. I didn't count. I have Bible software that does that for me. But of the 245 times, 198 of them are not translated as kindness, they're translated as love. And of those 198 times, most of them are attributed to God's posture towards his people. And so it's over and over again that God showed his love or showed his loyal love or his steadfast love. And so over and over again, it seems to be this language of saying this is God's disposition and posture and affection towards his people. And then the other times when it's translated as kindness, it's often humans trying to live out that characteristic. And so here's some things to connect this week to last week. Because last week we were reading Paul telling Titus, hey, in the midst of a bunch of people who are probably getting on your nerves, remember verse 4 of Titus 3, but when the kindness of God appeared, he saved them. That this idea of the kindness, the loyal love, this is the language that when Moses goes up on the mountain and he wants to learn about God's characteristics, it would say that he's gracious and compassionate, and he has this steadfast love, this hesed, this commitment obligation out of love that goes to 1,000 generations, that this is the language that's being described of David, and this is the language that's described of God, as if to say what David is doing is just displaying the characteristics of God in the world. Let's keep telling the story. The second half of verse 3 says, Ziba said to the king, there is still Jonathan's son who was injured in both feet. The king asked him, where is he? Ziba answered the king, you will find him in Lodabar at the house of Machir, son of Ammiel. And so you've watched enough Game of Thrones to know, you don't leave family members from the previous reign to show up in case something goes bad. But the crazy thing about this story is David actually isn't spending a lot of time killing anybody from Saul's family. I've mentioned to you before that Ishbosheth was around. He doesn't kill Ishbosheth. Ziba is from the house of Saul. David is married to one of the women, one of the daughters of Saul. There are actually 3 of the eldest sons of Saul that are still roaming around. There's a guy named Shimei who is hanging out, who's from the house of Saul. There are all these people from the house of Saul, and David's not dealing with them at all. And yet, there's this interesting conversation that Ziba says, well, Jonathan's son, who's lame in both feet, is still around. We don't get his name here, but he's actually mentioned earlier in the book, right after Ishbosheth gets assassinated, he is mentioned, and here's what it says of him in chapter 4, verse 4. Saul's son Jonathan had a son whose feet were crippled. Here's how it happened. He was 5 years old when the report about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. His nanny picked him up and fled, but as she was hurrying to flee, he fell and became lame. His name was Mephibosheth. Now, I don't often do this because sometimes it's distancing and unhelpful to talk about original language, but the original language where Mephibosheth comes from, the latter part of that name, Bosheth, means to come from shame. And theologians debate whether the first part of it means to remove shame or to come from the mouth of shame, but what's about him is there's something about shame in the story of this kid. And so think about that he's in the midst of the shame. He's in this place far from home, in exile, in the middle of the most difficult part of his life. The woman who's supposed to take care of him is running, and he falls down, and he is now can't walk in his feet. And David is asking questions about him. And biblical authors tend to do things that are meant to remind you of other things. So David shows up and he says, where is he? There's a moment in the scriptures that is equally chaotic, equally full of brokenness, equally full of people not being able to be who they were supposed to be. And that's Genesis chapter 3. And God shows up in the garden. Adam and Eve are hiding in shame. Don't miss the connection. Adam and Eve are hiding in their shame. And God says to them, hey, where are you? And then the place that he happens to be is a place named Lodabar. Again, knowing a little bit about the literal language, the original language, anytime you see lo in Hebrew, it means no or something is lacking. And literally, debar can mean one of two things. Either it can mean thing or it can mean pasture. So either way you read it, it's either a place of nothing or a place of no pasture. A place that doesn't produce what it's supposed to produce. A place that doesn't give life. A place that if it's meant to be no pasture, it isn't feeding the animals. And so again, you're supposed to be thinking these hints of, hey, the ground is supposed to be doing something. It's supposed to be yielding something, and it's not there. And so you've got this guy whose name has something to do with shame, who fell over and somebody trying to escape, sitting there not able to be all that he was able to be. Let me think about it a little bit more deeply. Can you imagine what it would be like to no longer be able-bodied, trapped in your shame, close enough to the throne to hear about it, but you can't reach it? Can you imagine what it would feel like in the most tragic moment of your life? The people who were supposed to care for you end up being the people that drop you, and now you're stuck in a place that can't feed you anymore. That you used to have this legacy, that you used to have this dynasty, that you get to be the one in the storybooks that people say, oh, you were supposed to be king someday, but you're not even able to take care of yourself, much less lead God's people. Can you imagine what it feels like to be stuck in Lodabar? When nothing around you to feed you and nothing around you to strengthen you, and history has forgotten you, and you don't have any way of getting out of that place. This is the story of Mephibosheth. I had to think that through. I wasn't sure I was going to make it back up there. And in the middle of this story, David pulls him out of that place. In Genesis 3, what happens is because of the brokenness and sin in the world, they get removed from the place that feeds them. But something is happening to turn that on its head, to redeem, to change the story. And so here's what verse 5 would say. So King David had brought from the house of Machir, had him brought from the house of Machir, son of Amiel in Lodabar. Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David, fell face down and paid homage. And David said, Mephibosheth, I am your servant, he replied. Do not be afraid, David said to him, since I intend to show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all your grandfather Saul's fields, and you will always eat meals at my table. Mephibosheth paid homage and said, what is your servant that you take an interest in a dead dog like me? And so see the beauty of what is happening. David is bringing him out, not as a political enemy to be executed, but as a friend to be part of the family. And then even hear the promise that he's making to him. He says, hey, don't be afraid. Again, biblical authors use language to remind you of things. And over in the biblical story, that language of don't be afraid often happens to be the first thing that would come out of the angel of the Lord's mouth when saying to somebody, hey, God is going to do something to save. And so don't be afraid is the language that shows up in Genesis 15 when God shows up with Abraham to make a covenant with him to say, hey, that I'm going to bless you. I promised you that 3 chapters ago, but now I'm going to actually give you a physical symbol of covenant to help you understand that. Don't be afraid is the language that Moses uses to tell the people when he's up on Mount Sinai and says that, hey, God wants to make a covenant with you. God wants to show something to you as people. In Luke chapters 1 and 2, when the angel shows up to Zechariah, it's don't be afraid. When the angel shows up to Mary, it's don't be afraid. When the angel shows up in the field with the shepherds, he's saying don't be afraid. And all of those messages are, I'm sending someone to save and redeem and rescue you. And David intentionally uses the same language with somebody who should be deathly afraid of the wrath of the king. But instead he says, hey, don't be afraid. I intend to show kindness to you. And then hear the promise of future restoration. Here's what I'm about to do. I'm going to give you back all the land that belonged to your granddaddy. He doesn't say granddaddy. I say granddaddy, but just stay with me. And then here, the second promise, the promise of present belonging. You get to sit at my table. Like, I don't want to miss the importance of tables. Y'all think that I like to eat a lot, and that is true. But it's also significant to me that over and over again, that where you find Jesus is sitting at tables with people who don't belong. That in fact, one of the biggest indictments against Jesus is that you are a glutton and a drunkard, because in Luke, everywhere, whether he is going to a meal or coming from a meal or at a meal, Jesus is eating with some folks. They in fact are like, hey, John the Baptist fasted. How come you don't fast? Because he's like, why would I fast? I'm here. Like nobody should be sad. You guys should be celebrating and getting to know me. Like, come to the table and know me. This promise of present belonging from one who obviously doesn't belong. And then the story finishes this way. The king summoned Saul's attendant Ziba and said to him, I have given to your master's grandson all that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to work the ground for him, and you are to bring in the crops so your master's grandson will have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, is always to eat at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Now, I don't want to move past that too quickly, but let me do something explanatory here. Part of that is just functional. Obviously, with an inability to walk, there's no way that he's going to be able to tend the fields and the land that he has. And so he needs somebody to functionally help him do that. And Ziba, both with his sons and his servants, has the ability, because I imagine the amount of land that Saul had as the former king is a little bit more than nothing. But then the second part of it is not just this idea of function, but it's this idea of form, that it's reordering, that now it's not just that you have land and you have to tend to it yourself, but you have land and you have those that are serving you, like you're being reestablished in this place of having dignity and having somebody to serve you. Something powerful is being shown with what's happening with Ziba. Ziba said to the king, your servant will do all my lord the king commands. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table, just like one of the king's sons. Like, think about that. You were an enemy of the state, and now you belong to the family. Like, you are a threat to my rule and reign, and now I treat you like you're one that's going to carry on the legacy for me. Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah. I mean, think about how this is going the opposite direction. If you were to continue to read into Chronicles, Micah is how it's said there, ends up having 4 sons. And so now a family that seemed to be shrinking into dignity and being forgotten in history is now continuing to expand. All those living in Ziba's house were Mephibosheth's servants. However, Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he was always at the king's table. And if this were a Lifetime movie, the credits would begin to roll. Soft music would begin to play. They would inset in the little side of the screen the credits while they played a commercial about here's how you can give $26 a day to save dogs that are in foster care. And that would be the end of it. But David's chronicler has to add this last verse in there, and his feet had been injured. We know, bro. You don't need to tell me that detail. I know the story. Like, why would you bring that up? Like, you ruined this moment. Like, man, he's got a son now. Life seems to be going well. He's sitting at the king's table. He got people working for him. He is back. This is pursuit of happiness type stuff. And then you're going to remind me that he's lame in both feet. I actually think there's a couple of reasons why that's important. I think one of those is I think it helps us to see the reality of this tension of already but not yet. And he already belongs, and he's already had some things be restored, but he's not fully all the way there. But I also think, you know what doesn't matter when everybody's sitting at the table? If your feet work. Tommy said it earlier during confession that part of the reason why we're honest about where we are is because it sets this level playing field. And the reality is that in that moment that he is no less able or no less capable in terms of what he's able to do when he's sitting at that table, that all of a sudden all of the distinction is being removed. And so the reality is, yes, if you look up under the table, he's lame in both of his feet. And the reality is, if I could fast forward, that if you looked up under our tables, that there would be some difficulty with our feet also. We're not all the way restored. So what do we do with that story? I said it to you before that the gospel is not just a theological term, it's a better story that we are invited to live. And I just want to walk you through the beauty of the gospel story and its pattern. And so on the screen behind me, you're going to begin to see some images. And it's the pattern of the gospel narrative. And the pattern of the gospel narrative, I'll just tell you up front, is creation, fall, redemption, restoration. And I want to walk through each of those, and the reality is that we're going to spend time looking at each of these more specifically week after week in this series, but I want to give you an opportunity to think about them now, and I want to relate the story that you just heard to this reality. And so we'll start with creation. Creation, I wrote it this way, God reigns over his creation. However, unlike human leaders who dominate their subjects, he rules with kindness, shaping the world for their flourishing. Just FYI, I'm going to give credit where credit's due. These images that you're seeing were actually drawn by my wife. And so I was working through this and like I can't draw. But I was like, in my mind, I could do such a, and she was like, oh, and she like grabs her iPad and like whips these out. And so if you're single, let me advise you, marry somebody that makes you better. So as we're walking through this, like, think about the reality of what we're seeing in the shadow of David. That he is this king that rules and reigns, and instead of dominating his subjects and his political enemies, that he is making space for those who don't belong to belong, that he's setting up an environment for him to flourish and find life, that this is God's disposition towards his creation. That if you're going to tell the gospel story, that the story starts here, that God doesn't start with judgment or wrath or needing to correct, that he starts with this posture of love and kindness, and what he makes is good, and he wants to interact with it and celebrate it and show the evidence of his kindness. Now, as I say that, you might be like, but that's not the world that I live in, and that's because the next phase of the gospel story is the fall. Here's what I wrote for the fall. But sin disrupts and distorts creation, causing it to turn away from God and in on itself. Now we are plagued by our own sin, wounded by others' sin against us, and trapped in a broken world. And this is what we see if you were to read Genesis chapter 3, but this is even what we see in Mephibosheth's story. That some of what he's enduring has nothing to do with him. It has to do with the sinfulness of Saul and Saul not honoring the Lord, and he's impacted by that. It has to do with as a little child being whisked away, falling over, and the brokenness of the world injures and impacts him. But there's also a part of him that could have thrown himself on the mercy of David, because there's a lot that's happened during this time period that's shown that David isn't killing political enemies, but somehow he seems to be distanced from him. The reality is that the world that you live in is desperately affected by the fall. And so you're plagued by your own sin. You can't get out of your own way. But also you're plagued by the wounds of the sins of other people, that broken people hurt and break other people. And then just in case that wasn't enough, the world's jacked up in and of itself on its own. And if the story stopped there, it would be awful and we would run from it. But then we begin to see a picture of redemption. I wrote it this way: but God sent Jesus, his son, to become like us, perfectly display God's character to us, and pay the full debt of our sin through his death on the cross. His death brings us life, and his resurrection secures our hope. Now here's the reality, all metaphors fall short. And so the story that we're reading, David doesn't give his life for Mephibosheth, but there's certainly something happening of a redeeming nature. And what's interesting about the redemption of God is when God shows his redeeming kindness to us, oftentimes it causes us to see ourselves as we are and say the truth about ourselves, that we are like dead dogs. Why would you consider us? But this is the kindness of God shown through redemption, that now he is sending his son to pay the debt of sin. And so now we are no longer enemies of the state. Now we get to be sons at the table. It's interesting to me that even when David would think about God's relationship towards him, one of the things that he would say is that you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You give me a place to sit down and belong when I shouldn't belong. This is part of our redemption. And then restoration. Restoration is the reality that now we live as part of new creation. Each day we move closer to the restored picture of God's reign, where everything is good and we know him without limits. And again, you see that picture at the end of the story, that Mephibosheth is sitting at David's table, one that fully belongs. One of the things I said to you last week is, as we think through the gospel narrative and we grow in it, that there's a moment that it becomes so natural to us that when you squeeze us, it's the gospel that comes out. This is actually not the last time that you see Mephibosheth in the scriptures. Shortly hereafter, David will begin to do some things that are not wise, and it begins to put difficulty in the kingdom. And then after that, there's a conflict with his son Absalom, and Absalom tries to take over the kingdom, and so David is leaving in exile. And as David's leaving in exile, Ziba shows up to him with all of these donkeys and all of these supplies, and he says, "Hey, my king, I'm your servant. I realize that you're going to probably need this stuff if you leave." And he's like, "Okay, where's Mephibosheth?" And he's like, "Well, Mephibosheth said, if you leave him, he can get his stuff back and he can restore his house." And then as David's continuing to leave, another man from the house of Saul, his name is Shimei, comes out and starts cursing David and throwing rocks at David. And David's men are like, "We can't kill Absalom, but we can get this dude." And David's like, "Nah, the Lord's telling him to say that. And maybe the Lord will turn it around for me, but today what he's saying is true." And so he moves on. Shortly thereafter, Absalom gets killed in battle. David is coming back, and as David comes back, he sees Mephibosheth, and the text would tell us that Mephibosheth hadn't washed his clothes, hadn't shaved, hadn't tended to the wounds on his feet since David had left. And David was like, "Why didn't you come with me?" And he said, "Ziba betrayed me. I tried to saddle my donkey myself, but I couldn't do it because I was lame, and Ziba betrayed me and left me here." He's like, "But here's the reality. You can do whatever you want because I don't have the right to ask you anything with all the stuff that you've done for me." Literally what he's saying is, after all that you've done for me and the way that I was and what you rescued me from, I have nothing left to ask from you. You're good with me. Like, this is where I'm at. And my prayer for us is that the gospel becomes so real that when we get squeezed, when there's an opportunity to become like the fall and turn in on ourselves and turn away from the one that created us, instead we say, after all he done did for me, I can't turn my back on him. After all the ways that he's restored me and rescued me and made a space for me, there's no way I'm turning my back on him. He has the right to do whatever he wants with his power in my life. It can get as bad as it's possibly gonna get, but I ain't leaving him. And so then David is like, "Hey, here's what we're going to do. We're going to divide the land between you and Ziba because I don't know who's telling the truth here." And here's what he says: "I don't care. Ziba can have all of it. I just want you." And my prayer for us is that we would be restored in such a way and fluent in the gospel in such a way that when life presses on us and it starts to take things away and say, "Will you still serve him? Do you still believe him? Will you still worship him?" We say, "You can have the stuff. I just want him." I told you I wasn't going to preach this morning, so let me stop. So Jeff Vanderstelt wrote it this way. So how do you become a gospel-centered culture full of gospel-centered or gospel-fluent people? We need gospel language that is correctly shaped by the gospel story. This is the story that shapes us. When I told the staff I was going to be preaching this text, they were like, "Haven't you preached this before?" I was like, "Actually, I have never preached an entire message on this text. I just talk about it all the time." And the reason that is the case is because I love this story. When I was 15 years old, I was not serving the Lord. I was in church every Sunday because my parents made me. You can only be so rebellious when your mom has to drop you off at your rebellion. And so I was not all that rebellious, but I was in church, like with just my heart as far from the Lord as it could be. And our church was doing like a special like revival set of meetings, and they had a well-renowned guest speaker coming in town. And my mom wanted to hear him, and so she told me and my nephew, hey, you guys got to get home as quick as you possibly can after practice. I was running track at the time. We're going to go grab McDonald's on the way. I don't know how you grew up. Maybe your mom got you really great food. We ate McDonald's. I still eat McDonald's. Don't judge me. It's my story. And so we go grab McDonald's. We get to the church parking lot. It's like a Wednesday night or a Thursday night. It was a fairly large church. Could seat something like 1,800 people. Massive parking lot, and the parking lot is full. Never seen the parking lot that full. We get in the building. They've got adults sitting in the nursery room, in like the nursery rooms, because there's no more seats. They ran out of seats there. They got adults sitting in aisles. The church had a balcony. I'm sitting in the balcony on the stairs, as uncomfortable physically and spiritually as I possibly could be. I'm like, I don't want to be here. I don't want to be here on Sundays, much less being here on a Wednesday or Thursday night. Preacher gets up and begins to preach. And he starts telling the story of Mephibosheth, and I realize, that's me. That I am full of shame. That I have been unfaithful to the king. That I don't deserve any mercy, and yet what I'm being invited to is to sit at the table and know the kindness of God that's being shown to me. Now, sometimes we do some weird things where we try and put ourselves in Bible stories that we don't belong in, right? Like we try and be like, David and Goliath, I'm David. No, you ain't. You're the rest of Israel that's hiding behind the battle line saying, will somebody come take care of this for me? But this might be one story where this is about you. That you have been an enemy of the state, that you have been unfaithful and rebellious to the king, that you don't deserve any kindness or mercy or steadfast love, and yet he's offering it also, that you were completely unaware of what he was offering to you, and he brings you out of the place of no pasture that you're in and sets you before the table. And in the middle of all this, you're not all the way restored, but you're a lot stronger today than you used to be. This is the story that shapes us. And part of what I want to offer to you is the freedom to be honest about where you are. Because nobody wins when we try to pretend to be whole when we're not whole. Nobody wins when we try to pretend that everything is all right when things are not all right, but for us to be as we are and know that here's the posture of the king towards his creation, that he sees it with kindness and wants to offer us what's good and to accept and trust that. That's the greatest story that you could ever live. The gospel is not just a genre of music or a theological term or a group of historical narratives about Jesus. It's a story that you're being invited to know and to live. A good God sees the sin of the world and has made a way to redeem you through his son, Jesus. And now he is restoring all things and making them new. Do you want to be a part of that? My prayer is that we would become fluent in that for ourselves and for others. Let's pray together. So Jesus, this morning I just pray that we would know that we have a king who sits upon his throne that is longing to show kindness of those who have been rebellious against his kingdom. I pray that we would know that in spite of the ways that we have fallen and been broken and been impacted by the sins of those that are around us, that you are sending your love, your mercy, your compassion, your steadfast love towards us out of covenant commitment that you've made towards your people. And because that's true, we get drawn out of a place of emptiness that is starving us and strangling us. And we get invited into a place of knowing you for who you are and all of your kindness, and getting this future promise of what we're going to experience and what you're going to restore to us, but also this present promise of belonging with you here and now. And that though it's not all restored, that we're already beginning to see the effects of the new that is to come. And we're seeing them more day by day. And we get to live in that. And we're not excluded just because we're not all the way there yet, but you still have a place for us. So Lord, would you stir our hearts with that? For some of us, would it be the desperately needed reminder of the story that needs to win our life? Not the story of achievement, not the story of approval, not the story of comfort, not the story of acceptance, but the story of you as the God of the universe making space for your enemies to know your kindness. And then for others, maybe this is the clearest they've ever heard the story. Would they hear that you are looking for them, even if their life and their name has been marked with shame? Call them home, Jesus. It's in your matchless name I pray. Amen. Amen.
Thanks so much for checking out this message from Kings Harbor. We would love to connect with you. If you go to kingsharbor.org/hello and fill out a short connect card, that allows us the opportunity to follow up with you. Also, if this message has been a blessing to your life, we believe that the Lord wants to rule and reign in every part of who we are. That means our time, our talent, our treasure. And so if this has been a blessing, we would ask that you would consider contributing back to the ministries of Kings Harbor so we can continue to bless and help people in the same way that we hope we have done for you. With that in mind, we want you to know that our heart towards you and our heart towards the world around us is that we want to be a love-forward people. And we're praying that you would join us in that.